All right, Tennessee Republicans laid out several proposals this year to crack down on illegal immigration.
One of those proposals to track the immigration status of students in grades K through 12. Joining us now via Zoom is Chalkbeat Tennessee's Bureau Chief Melissa Brown. Welcome back, Melissa.
Thanks for having me.
So this is the first time this kind of legislation has the real chance of getting approved. And you spoke with the executive director of Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, an immigration advocacy group, about this. What are the concerns they voiced to you?
I think broadly, that group specifically was saying that they don't think that this should be an education priority for Tennessee. It could be a large administrative burden on local teachers, local schools, not to mention downstream effects on students, their families, and the community. And yeah, Turk was saying that teachers should be able to focus on educating their students and caring for their classes without worrying about, where their students might have been born.
And there are a lot of unanswered questions about how this would work. One includes whether it would impact the federal education fund. How does this concern impact a similar bill in 2025?
Right. So this issue, like you just mentioned, first came up last year. There was a joint effort by House and Senate Republicans to pass a bill that would not only track the immigration status of students, whether a student was a citizen or a legal resident or an undocumented immigrant, would track that information, but also allow local schools to either deny enrolling the child altogether or to charge them tuition to attend the public school. That bill last year got a lot of pushback, both within the legislature. There were a lot of protests. I think thousands over several days came to the Capitol to protest that bill. One of the sticking points was that there has been long-standing Supreme Court precedent in the country, as well as federal education kind of guidance about the ability for students, all children in the United States, to receive a free and public education. And there were concerns that if Tennessee passed a bill tracking the immigration status of students and denying some students an education, that they could be sued over that law. And the sponsors at the time actually wanted that to happen. They wanted to challenge this longstanding Supreme Court precedent in a case called Plyler. And the other concern regarding federal education funding is because of that longstanding precedent. There were concerns that Tennessee could be at risk of receiving a really massive federal infusion that all states receive to help fund public schools in the state. The issue that is still going on is that lawmakers, or they say that they are talking with federal officials about this issue. They asked for guidance from the federal education department, federal officials about whether or not Tennessee funding could be affected. I know that they asked this last April. They said last week they're waiting for an answer, but we're coming up on a year and there's no clear understanding on whether or not this legislation would threaten federal funding for education.
So your article mentions some lawmakers hoped at one point to challenge that longstanding U.S. Supreme Court precedent that protects public education access for undocumented children. Have you heard any plan to pursue that again?
Well, the mechanism to challenge the longstanding Supreme Court precedent would be to pass a law that might trigger a lawsuit. We see this a lot in legislatures. A lot of times they're passing laws that they think will go into effect and will affect everyday Tennesseans' lives. Sometimes they're passing laws to specifically challenge current legal precedent. What would happen is a bill, and again, we haven't seen details of this specific legislation, but a bill would pass, and there might be cause from some Tennesseans to sue over the bill if they found that it was unconstitutional, and then that could trigger over many months, sometimes years, the potential to challenge the Supreme Court precedent. So it's hard to say if this specific effort this year would have grounds to do that. But I do think that we can fairly say that the sponsors of this legislation last year explicitly said that that was their goal then. And so it's sort of a wait and see approach this year if it will go down that same path.
I was going to ask you if there were any next steps to keep watch for.
Yeah, we actually don't know necessarily the details of this specific bill. The bill last year actually passed in the Senate and stalled in the House. That bill is still technically live. It could be brought back with some changes. There could be some like conference kind of compromise committees between both chambers. But it was announced last week. I asked several questions of Republican leaders about, who might be required to collect this information, who would be asked to verify citizenship documentation from parents, for example, and also who would hold that data. Would that be the school that protects the data? Would that data be shared with state law enforcement? And right now, Republican officials don't have any answers on those questions.
All right. Thank you, Melissa Brown from Chalkbeat.